Ready Player Will.
Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. This is the Shadowlynx, the Crystalborn review. Brand new unit added to Global this week. Today's presentation, pretty standard things. The character overview, base and total stat analysis, and these stat analyses are slightly improved this week because I'm going to be building toward a case that'll make a lot more sense when I get to the general thoughts. So a little bit graph heavy to start, but nothing too crazy. We're going to go through all of those stats leading up to the report card where we grade them in the context of her kit and the rest of the characters. We'll talk about those general thoughts, just some quick hit things that I really want to talk through. We'll look at the job then more specifically in the passives, the counters, the job ability and auto priority. We'll look at the TMR just to gauge whether she's a pull worthy of a really solid TMR, the job-based division card eligibility, some general optimization pieces, and then I have one sample build here at the end as opposed to the two. We'll talk about why later. And then finally capping things off with Truststones. But for now, brand new water unit added to the game here. They've given her the unique main job of Crystalborn Archer. She does also have range and axe knight as the subjobs. She is a bow unit, which we have not had in a little while here, that also equips hats, cloths, and accessories with a move of 3, jump of 2 as a 70 cost unit and a 50 faith recommendation for sure. Now the max range on the main job here is 5 squares away, but she does have a passive that's range plus 2 that you'll frequently be using, so that max range really gets upwards to 7, even potentially 8 if you were to use another passive. It's 1 main job AoE and 3 single target abilities. The limit break is AoE oriented as well. From a resistance standpoint, 15% to slash and the 10% to magic, 5% to pierce and the neutral at 0 to missile with the minus 10% to strike. Now that's obviously exceptionally worrisome. That minus 10% can be a somewhat difficult one to dig through, but relatively speaking, everything else is decently okay. From an ailment perspective, 50% to poison, 50% to slow, and a 10% to sleep. The poison and the sleep certainly nice, but being a 50 faith unit, again, she's going to be naturally a little hedged against receiving those ailments, so I think this is a pretty good spot for her as well. The mastery ability, it's 15% missile res penetration permanently for her damage, and then 5% HP, which honestly not all that great. Now the dream ability, they did give her 15 AoE res and 30 reaction block rate permanently. Walk through the stats now, and starting off with the base HP here, she is slightly above average, coming in below the 75th percentile though, definitely a little bit below where most 3rd anniversary units are. That's honestly not surprising though, given that she's a missile unit. If you conceptually think of how missile units typically are built, they do skew a little bit lower on the HP and the attack side. They make up for it with some higher dex, typically some higher agility, and they basically try to get more turns in than your average damage dealer. Whether or not that happens here will remain to be seen, but this is where I'm going to start layering in some extra context here. And you don't have to think too hard about this. I'm going to hold your hand through it. What I've done for a handful of these metrics, I wanted to compare Shadowlynx to Crystalborn to a smaller sample size of top-end missile-oriented units, and then I wanted to compare them to a set of recent and more top-end physical damage units, and I went for a variety of them where Eld is a little more of like a frontline bruiser, same with A2, 2P is obviously more evade-oriented, Alai is obviously just a nuker, and so I've tried to essentially like color code these to easily read them, and you can basically read these charts left to right in the order of the characters that you see at the bottom, and I typically have the base amounts here and the total amounts here. They're very much close, but I have them both just for comprehensiveness. And so as we go these, I want to compare Shadowlynx not only to a similar sample size of missile units, but to the more general sample size of top-end damage dealers. And so for base HP, she definitely has an edge on your typical missile unit. It's not by a ton, maybe 100 to 300 base HP. If you consider that a vision card would give you 25%, that means she's getting anywhere from 25 to 75 more HP than your average missile unit. So it's not a huge incremental difference. She is decently far behind the bruisers, obviously, with young Eld and A2 here, but relatively in line with an evade unit like 2P and Alaya, who's a little bit on the squishier side. But overall, yeah, Shadowlynx starts off at a better spot than most missile units here, and obviously a step back from many of the other physical damage dealers. But let's keep going here. Base attack stat just makes it into this middle bracket here of concentration at 377 base attack. Definitely skews a lot lower than your average damage dealer, which again, we kind of conceptually know. And if we were to factor that into, again, the same view of things here with the base attack and then total attack, and again, the total includes things like mastery abilities, board nodes, 140 upgrades, things like that. So compared to your average missile unit, she's relatively in line with Melnia and Irvine. Like there's not a huge difference there compared to the more frontlining physical damage dealers. I would say relatively in line as well. Even when you consider total attack, it's not a huge drop off between these missile units and the normal DPS. So total attack, it's good. I would say it's at par with the other missile units, but nothing crazy. Now, for the base agility, she's definitely in the central bucket here, coming in at 58, skews just a smidge higher in the base agility. But, this is only one component of it. Agility has a lot of other factors that we'll talk through later once we look at more comprehensively. But for now, the base dexterity, this is definitely where she does take a major step ahead of most units. A lot of these outliers here in the Box and Whisker plot are your missile-oriented units. She's not quite at that level, but way, way above what your average unit is. That being said, we've seen that crit hit damage is not as impactful as it really could or should be. It's not a massive influence on the damage equation overall. And if we were again kind of comparing that same view of her to the missile units and her to the physical damage dealers, she's actually relatively aligned again with Melnia and Irvine. The three of them are very much clustered very, very frequently. She's actually decently amount behind Ice, Alaya, and Eliza. When you include the total nodes and whatnot, they are definitely a small step ahead of your typical frontline damage dealer. But again, purely evaluating missile versus missile, Shadowlynx is like right there with the group of the rest of them. Now for base luck, she's kind of in that central bucket as well, neither strength nor weakness, right about at that median. And again, last time, or almost last time we'll see this, compared to other missile units, she's relatively in line with Melnia and Irvine, definitely a step behind a lot of these other frontline damage dealers as well. So again, the same recurring story is here that she's not significantly better than your average missile unit. She's maybe slightly better in a couple aspects, maybe slightly below in a couple others. But on a lot of these metrics, if we look at the total luck here on the right, which includes the board and whatnot, she's relatively in line with a lot of them. So not. Now, as we look at the reconciliation of the base stats to the total stats, base stat-wise, not a ton of surprises here from what we might think. A little higher in the dexterity, but everything else is relatively average. It's not in the worst spot. When you consider the total stats, they'll bring in all those extra board nodes and whatnot. It's roughly the same story. It's just that the HP and attack take a slight step back. And just looking purely at where she gets us from, those 6 agility points are actually way below average for what most units get on the board. Most units get anywhere from 9 to 12 nowadays. Dexterity and luck, they actually do a decent job giving her a couple extra points here. But overall, not the worst spot. Now, for agility, when you start including the 15% and 8% vision cards, she comes in around the 77 or so, rounding up to that 78. Right in line with your average unit. She does have a passive that you can equip that you will have on a decent chunk of time that does put her into the next higher category of the mid 80s. So not the fastest unit in the world, but definitely, faster than your average unit, I would say. You can get that up with vision cards and whatnot, as we'll see at the end. Now for the agility, when we think of going back here for a second, this green chart in the bottom right, when we look at these characters with passives, with 15% and 8% vision cards, we're going to take another look here at the overall speed. She does come in a smidge faster than your average missile unit here, but really kind of in a blend of the other damage dealers. So that's a good thing for her as a missile unit, that she does tend to be a smidge faster from a couple agility point perspective. I do think that's worth its salt. Now we look at crit hit and crit avoid. She also skews very high in the crit rate side of things, coming at 101. A lot of that's due to the crit rate board node she gets, in addition to the base dexterity. The crit avoidance rate is average. This is not a real strength or weakness for her. But again, we look at the overall comparison of crit rate. She's basically in line with a lot of those missile units. Melnia and Irvine, again, really consistent comparisons. Eliza obviously a lot higher, and Alaya just a smidge below, but even Alaya has a passive that I'm not including here. And this is where you see their niche coming in above the average damage dealer, that they're really like 20% crit rate higher or so. And Shadowlynx is definitely in that company. Now for the accuracy, average accuracy is average. Without those passives, it's nothing crazy. She does have a passive for 25% that you can equip. You may not always have it on though, so this is slightly misleading in this higher bound of what she can get for accuracy. Even when you go that route, she's still good, but not nearly top of the charts. Still at the bottom range of a lot of units. And we consider this view again. There is some variability here in terms of missile unit accuracy, but Shadowlynx is overall like in a relatively competitive spot with most of them. So it's not necessarily a weakness, but again, this is including the passives. You take that 25 passive off, Shadowlynx drops to where Irvine is here, down toward this bottom rung. And so yeah, accuracy is just slightly suspect depending upon your build. Now evasion, she comes in at 108% evasion. I wouldn't consider an evade unit. I wish bow units and missile units had more evasion capabilities. That's a whole different topic, but unfortunately, I don't think she's it, which brings us to the report card. Finally, so effective HP, going with a C here. No defense, no spirit, 15 AoE res, and no unit res, a much lower overall health pool. The resists, as we saw, are okay, but not exceptional. So going with a C here for effective HP. The survivability, I'm actually going with a D plus here. But I think I'm being slightly harsh, but here's the thing. She's got 20 unit res on a main buff. Her secondary buff is a honeycomb barrier. That's nice. We've seen it be okay. It's not a game changer, though, for survivability. The sub-job buff, though, the 7,500 HP barrier is enormous. That alone, I think, could easily bring this grade up much higher. But again, there's enough barrier break in the game that should you break that, which we're seeing an increase in the game. There's really not a whole lot here for her survivability. There's no courage, there's no re-raise. Her counter abilities are okay. There's a reflex that we'll see, but survivability is definitely below average, which there's no like health heal back. There's no counter ability to reduce damage. She's got some utility that is oriented toward reducing enemy damage, so she'll take more hits than your average missile unit, but in the broad scheme of the game, going with a D plus here. Now the average, I'm going with a C here. The attack stat, actually very respectable for missile unit. Her attack stat, I was very happy with. Only 40 defense pen innately, though. There's no attack percent buffs or like physical damage percent up buffs. The crit damage upside is there, but as we've seen, crit damage is not a massively impactful source of damage, at least on regular attacks, it seems. So overall damage, I'm going with a C here. I'm tempering expectations due to the ceiling on the defense pen there. Now agility, going with a B. She's at 77 versus 78 average with passives, goes up to the 83 versus 81. It's not bad. That passive may not always be on. Again, we're going to keep talking about that as we go through this. The accuracy, going with a B minus here. The innate accuracy is average. You won't always have it on, but she does have the 25%. So if you do, the accuracy goes up, but if not, accuracy is not great. She is sharpshoot capable, but that ability is not nearly as good as it used to be in the state of the game. So I'm not relying on that for a lot of my anti-evasion. Now on the evade note, C minus, not an evade unit. The movement is an A though. The jump 2 is very nice. The move -1 option, also very nice. I don't know what else you could possibly want for a movement for a missile unit. That is exceptional. They gave her both of them. The auto ease of use, I'm going with a C minus here. The range calculations are always complicated and ever changing, where you always have to consider, all right, what's the map? Okay, what's the enemy move? Do they move +1 or are they not? What's the topography of how they group up? What is my first turn move and what's my bait range? Those things are very difficult for the average player and they change every single map and meta. The buffs are flexible enough that I don't think the buffs are going to give you a lot of trouble, but missile builds obviously are also very hit and miss with how much survivability is enough survivability and how much damage is enough damage. Very difficult conceptually. So C minus for the auto ease of use. The game disruption, also going with a C here. Missile's not making waves. She doesn't really change that. She's a great missile unit, but there's a lot to unpack there that we'll talk about more soon. The passives are a B plus here. She does have good enough passives. I just wish you could equip more than the 2. I wish one of them was just slightly built out a little bit more. The counter abilities, I'm going with an A here, though. General reflex, there's been so many fights, even though it's a low proc rate, it seemingly always comes back to bite you in the butt, so I gotta go with an A there. There is a preemptive ranged hit, though, which I do like for some extra chip damage, maybe killing an enemy before they get a hit off on her. The overall job and kit, I'm going with an A minus. She actually has a very good overall kit with a ton of really good utility, a lot of unique mechanics, great AP management and crit rate management, AoE versus unit scaling abilities, so she can pick and choose her attacks. And the funny thing here is obviously the kit tends to determine the value of a character. Very rarely do these stats mean a whole lot in their final grade, because the stats can be changed and built and they change over time statistically. But the final grade, I'm going with a C here. The game is utterly imbalanced for missile. It's even worse so for bow because of the vision cards that they have. And as we went through all those stats just now, there's nothing statistically that really sets her apart from Melnia or Irvine. They're like right neck and neck on most stats. The big differentiators for me are the HP barrier, but even Irvine has a barrier, so somewhat apples to apples. And the fact that her effective HP is just slightly higher, the honeycomb barrier contributes to that. We'll talk more about that in the general thoughts here, though. So I already started. The 7,500 HP barrier. All the other metrics are right in line with your average missile unit. The effective HP is slightly better than some, but below your general DPS, in my opinion. We'll see the sample build in the end. She does have a good utility, though. Dispel Courage, certainly nice, but Courage is not as difficult to deal with as Re-Raise is, because 1 HP enemy is way different than a 3000 HP enemy on re-raise. The minus 30 chain res to enemy is certainly a nice piece for some follow-up attacks. She does have a general dispel and a nullify haste and damage buff for 3 turn. That one is very, very good. We obviously love to see dispel. She also has a unique mechanic that she can seal enemy debuffs for 3 turns. That those enemies, if they had an apparel, let's say, they can't actually proc it on your team. So that is a nice way to prevent you from getting debuffed, which is a major source of potential damage. If you can seal the enemy's ability to crush your AoE res, that's a pretty big metric for survivability. She does also have, on that note, 50% AoE crush on her own limit break with a 20% physical and magic damage nerf on that limit break. So there's a lot of good stuff there that does have some play with her survivability, that should you be able to remove enemy dispel capabilities, should you nerf their damage enough that she can survive, I think it's there. But Bo is in an absolutely abhorrent place for job-based vision cards. It really does limit her to mono water, in my opinion, which is fine. Water is actually very good. I think people still sleep on that element. And as a 70 cost water missile unit, she is a top tier addition to that element. She absolutely adds what they needed in terms of a relatively solid missile unit and at a much reduced cost as well. So 2 thumbs up for that. She is relatively in line with other 70 costs. We have seen, though, if we're looking at the standard, the most impactful 70 cost units have been support generalists like Shal's, where very good Rainbow, very good, takes very little to support the team, because she really just lets the team do the work for her. We've seen raw numbers of Vade and Halloween Lucio. His meta timing was very good. Very, very, very good. That there was something very special for the timing when he came in and for what Earth did, because Wind wasn't all that strong and the top meta units weren't all that accurate, so he came in at a good time. Or you could be a meta countering unit like Winter Wrath, which she came in at the height of Vivi Helena and did just exceptionally well against that magic meta. I don't think Shadowlynx is really any of those things in terms of impact, so that's why my game disruption grade's a little bit lower. But for a 70 cost unit, she's absolutely among some of the best you could possibly pull. She's the best bow unit, in my opinion. I mean, again, if we're looking at the UR bow units overall, I think she's the best bow unit here. And I don't even know if it's close. Eliza is very much fallen off a cliff. CT has never reached her ceiling. Charisse, I don't think has seen the light of day because it's just not enough people pulling for her. There's nothing special about her. Nivlu has seen some use in JP because of the slow upgrade on her limit break and all the stuff that came with that. But yeah, I think she's the best bow unit. So Gumi does have the opportunity to really make her shine in the future if they do some things right, but we obviously don't have the foresight for that. I do think that the lack of role compression kind of makes her difficult to slot into Guild War teams, where we are seeing at the moment, okay, well, if you have a dedicated damage dealer, do they also have any healing support? Do they have any bulk support? Do they have any things that can bleed into the other roles? She doesn't. There's no healing. There's no frontline presence. In terms of teammate amplification, there's not a ton. There's a lot for enemy disruption, which certainly has high impact, but I do think she's great for single play, like quick pick and arena, things like that. I could definitely see more upside there for her. Now, water PvE, like Guild Raid, has been pretty consistent in who you end up using, but she does have a 30% chain res in peril, the crit damage upside. She's got a double hit and a triple hit on the sub job. So, for the future Guild Raids, they might do something for missile like they did for magic damage in terms of artificially inflating it, and she definitely could be a candidate that would do well with that, just given some of the things she has. Now, the last thing I'll talk about here, and this is going to be the crux of my motivation and the grade and the thoughts, the durability and effective HP basically boil down to how many hits can you take. That's why things like Courage and Re-Raise were always disproportionately good on some damage dealers, because it was basically a free extra hit they could take. And so for missile units, they've consistently been to taking 2 hits at most. I'll be honest, Irvine bucked this trend recently. I've seen him in many Guild War fights where he takes 3 to 4 because he does have physical barrier. He does have a health regen ability on his 120 ability. But even for him, that still didn't work because they typically have limited options for survivability. There typically isn't a health regen component. The counter abilities are not as impactful as the average damage dealer, where we've seen some of these 60% proc rate or 70% proc rate counter abilities that drastically reduce damage, or maybe they do a self-heal, or maybe they do some kind of buff. Missile units don't get that. And Shadowlynx really didn't either. There is no self-heal mechanic in her kit. Her survivability is limited to that 7,500 HP barrier, and hoping the honeycomb barrier chips in a little bit. The only counter ability that has any salt is the reflex from a survivability perspective. I mean, the preemptive ability, maybe you kill an enemy before they hit you, but the thing is, I do think Lynx is definitively in a category where she can take 2 hits, no problem. That's a great starting point. I think she can probably take 3 hits, depends on the type of damage she's receiving. She gets that barrier broken, game over. With the limit break, in terms of the physical damage nerf that she applies to enemies, the fact that she can seal their debuff potential, meaning they can't imperil her with anything, that can very likely prevent a lot of damage upside. So I do think she has far more survivability than your average missile unit, that I do think she will live more than 2 hits. That's very important. And I really think that's the key thing that sets her apart from how most of them are unplayable in majority of instances. She at least can be playable. Again, I think more for single match play, not for double matches, like going for a second Guild War attack or hoping for a second Guild War defense. I don't think that's always there. Now, I know we're running long, so I'm going to go through this real quick, but I do want to take a second to talk about the passives. The tough thing about this, Shinobi's Pride is excellent. Agility 12%, reaction block 35, decreased move, but that means that you're stuck with heavy draw bow skills, which is also very impactful with the 40 defense pen. The range 2. She doesn't have this. She's got no defense pen at all in the kit. So to me, I think those 2 are your best bets, but if you want to extend her range for her survivability, or you want to give her the accuracy, you got to pick to drop one of these. That doesn't feel very good. So these are good abilities, but man, there's some really hard, difficult decisions in the trade-offs you have to make. The counter abilities, that Retaliation Arrow is a preemptive ability. Certainly like to see this. The Reflexo, I think, is my favorite, just for the general survivability of both physical and magical damage. The main job buffs, the teammate buff is a very diamond-oriented one, because when you have that move -1, you need to be able to still reach a teammate near you. It's the 20 unit res, 20 crit damage amplification, the decreased chain res of 30 on hit for 3 turns, and 15 AP restore. The secondary one is the honeycomb barrier, but it's also water attack of 20. So nice little offensive buff there. The main job offensive abilities, you have 1 AoE and 3 unit scaling. One of them is a select 2 on the very far right here. Her basic ability is fine. It's basically an AP regen ability if you kill an enemy. The second one here is the remove courage and guaranteed hit. I somehow forgot to mention that earlier in the guaranteed hit options. That's actually a very, very good option to have, that it's obviously superior to sharpshoot for the extra utility in the mod. The anti-enervation bombardment is the one that seals enemy debuffs for 3 turns, also recovers some AP, so again, great AP management there. And the twin curse shot is the select 2 that is the general dispel and removes their capability to proc haste for 3 turns or proc physical damage buffs for 3 turns. So that's absolutely very good as well. The limit break is an AoE in a crush shape here, that it's a 50% area crush and reduces enemy damage by 20% for 3 turns. The sub job here, it's 2 pretty basic attacks. One's a double hit, one's a triple hit. One does have a slow chance on it, theoretically. Again, great for potential PvE upside, but nothing too crazy here from the sub job. The Ranger sub job, we're all familiar with this one. I think this one is inferior. I don't think it adds really anything to that the main job doesn't already have, but it's the Axe Knight. The Axeman's Ward, this buff alone could completely change his character to give her that 75 HP barrier. Obviously, the attack and agility buff, very potentially good as well. That's really all I would have on the sub job, and that's enough. Now the TMR review, this TMR actually not that bad. The fact that it's a cloth certainly is a step behind what you'd like to see. It's a potentially repetitive buff that you can use it twice if you don't manage your AI right, but the 25 slash res and the reducing of slash res pen certainly in tandem is a nice piece of survivability in that niche versus slash oriented enemies. I like this for just adding into the game in general. I like the ability to reduce enemy slash pen. It's not my favorite TMR. I really like that they created it though. Now for the job-based mission cards, Bow is severely undertuned for rainbow potential. I'm really reaching here for what you might, synergize with. The Spear group is 1 because of Under the Red and Blue Moons. Then you also have Natural Loner, which is the Irvine card that has like the attack percent, all those other things that do synergize well with the missile unit. But man, Dagger's the same exact argument. It's really not great. There is no AoE res card for this group. On this agility card that they have, it has nothing in common with the rest of the groups here for AoE or unit res. The New Year's Banquet, which is the other unit res card, that's the only one it has in common with the Staff Black Mage, the Book, and the Sword Warrior. So there's so much that needs to be done here to make them viable in a rainbow team. It's a real deficiency for them. Now the general optimization, I actually think the Yoichi's bow is my favorite because of the hate reduction. It's -8 hate to start. I love that for missile units. Her weapon's obviously very good, though, for what it does for the AP management, the crit damage. Rune Bow, I still love for the accuracy. Those of you that don't know about Rune Bow, the accuracy gets up to 39. Yes, 39 accuracy on the Rune Bow. So for that perspective. I love that. The other equips, pretty standard stuff here. My favorite low-key is actually the Fairy Flask. I have that in my sample build here at the end here, but the other ones like Sharpshooter Monocle has some nice utility, but the rest are really just survivability oriented, from the Survival Vest, the Silent Solar Rays, the 2 different pod accessories. The Espers, you're pretty typical damage-oriented Espers. Maybe you go for one for an element res in a specific matchup, but I think these are pretty straightforward for what you'd want. I do like Ultros for the defense pen. I think that's super valuable. And the TMRs, I don't consider her a TMR unit just because as a ranged unit, she's more likely to hit earlier than your average unit. So I don't really like any TMR ability that's better than what she already has between her main job and the barrier buff. Now for the sample build, I went mono water here. I went for one where it's Young Eld and Summer Glaciella. The vision cards, you have some play with here. I figured go with, water has a couple different agility cards you could put in the sub slot, so it does not have to be Dark Shiva. I went with this water attack sub card on Lynx because it's got water attack and accuracy up. That just kind of well-rounded the party. For Elds, I had the attack percent and the AP, acquired AP. Got some magic res on there as well. So this, I like what this does for them. For the equips, I went with the Yoichi Bow and I went with the Fairy Flask. Just to recap, because I'm sure most of you have not seen this or farmed it, this is the Crystal Warrior accessory that came out relatively recently. It's all elemental res of 5%, and it'll get removed after 2 hits. She's only taken 2 to 3 hits, so that's basically an extra 5 element res, human killer of 10, and decrease AP consumption of 15. It's also got some extra AP here on the builds, as crit evade, decent enough defense. I like that accessory for her. I went with the bells just as a stat stick. The Shinobi's Pride and Heavy Draw Bow Skills, those are the 2 passives that I recommend with the Reflex. The Truststones set, little preview of what I think is best for her. So when you get to the overall stats, 9,500 HP, definitely below many damage dealers where you see them at least 10k, particularly in the mono element with the MA2 buffs, what you get for like HP 10% for all units. In mono water, she only gets up to 9,500. Defense 20, Spirit of 8, it's fine. 1,524 attack is actually very nice, but that is kind of being propped up by the Astrologer subcard here. 118 agility, definitely very nice here. 493 dex, the luck is very low at 385. Only 15 unit res in this build, but 35 AoE res. She's up to 85% reaction block rate, which is very much intentional. I want her to be as high to 100% as I can. 72% acquired AP. Overall, I got it to positive resistances here. Some of that's from the dark espers here on Glassy. And the element resistance is honestly not bad either. Again, a lot of that is coming from the Fairy Flask, but I also have the HP Truststone set it's adding another 5%. So I do like this approach to it. It's got -8 hate, 15% decreased AP consumption, and the range +2. The modifier is actually really good here. 74 water attack, 20 missile attack, 53 human killer, all adds up to a nice enough amount. Only 50 defense pen and only 15% missile res pen, but most top tier units right now are negative missile res, so the penetration for missile is not as big of a concern as it was a little while ago. But that's the build, and I don't want to do a second one here because I don't think there's a good rainbow build, and I think any other water build I do would be relatively similar from a stat perspective. Now the Truststones, I think HP is your best one to go with. Luck obviously for accuracy, maybe crit evade in the future. I'm not going to get into it now, but she's one of those units I might entertain it. The passives, HP, luck, and I would just go with 4 different element reses just to try to bump up the element res for those matchups. The right side, attack 20%, defense pen 10. I do like the water attack 10, the reaction block of 20, the acquired AP and dex of 15. You could throw crit rate and crit damage in there, but I think this current right side is perfectly fine as is. And that's the Shadowlynx to Crystalborn review. I know it's kind of a complex topic because missile units are in a category of their own at the moment. She's a really good unit. I just don't want to mislead anyone to spending 6k paid on her either, considering that, she's more expensive to pull than your average unit. There's a cheaper paid alternative, but I want to be realistic about the impact she's really going to have. The game is really not in a spot right now to support what she's doing. She's a really great addition, though, to Water as a missile unit where that fills a gap that they did not have. I think compared to other missile units, she's among some of the best you could possibly ask for. But again, if the bar for damage dealers is up here and missile units are right here, well, being the best missile unit still doesn't mean much in the broad scheme of the game. So I'm really trying to be realistic about my approach here. But that's everything for now. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'll talk to y'all later.